June 1945. The battle for Okinawa had already dragged on for weeks, transforming the island into a living nightmare of smoke, mud, and fire. Artillery boomed constantly from the hills, and the air was thick with ash and the distant drone of bombers. In a devastated field once used for rice farming, now pitted with craters, a young Japanese woman lay on her side in a shallow depression filled with rainwater. Her name was Eiko Furuya, and she was in labor. Alone, barefoot, and shaking, she clutched her swollen belly as another contraction tore through her body. The crater offered the only cover in a landscape flattened by violence. The bamboo groves that once bordered the field were burned down, the village nearby reduced to rubble. Eiko had crawled there during the night after her home collapsed under a shell blast. Her husband had died 3 days earlier trying to find food, his body never recovered. Now, in this wet hole in the earth, she was giving birth, not to the cries of loved ones, but to the sound of falling bombs. Her water had broken hours before. Blood and mud mixed beneath her, her thighs trembling with exhaustion. Her breathing grew erratic. The pain was constant, dull and sharp at once, pulsing in her back and hips like waves. She bit down on her knuckle to keep from screaming. She was afraid to draw attention, afraid to die, but more afraid to be found. Nearby, an American medic patrol from the 383rd Regiment was making its way across the southern fields. The unit consisted of Sergeant John Murray, a pre-war surgeon, Corporal Joe Banks, a trained field medic, and Hana Oda, a Japanese-American interpreter and former medical student. They had been sent to sweep the area for wounded civilians, a task often futile and dangerous. The terrain was riddled with hidden mines and sniper fire, and the sky offered no peace. As they passed the edge of the field, Banks froze. A sound, something weak, strained, carried on the wind. At first, it seemed like the cry of an animal. Then they heard it again, sharper this time, like a cry caught in water. Murray raised his binoculars and scanned the area. Through the smoke and grass, he saw movement, bare skin, a shaking hand. It wasn't a soldier. It was someone trying to live. They approached cautiously. Hana called out in Japanese, her voice calm but urgent. No reply came. When they reached the edge of the crater, they saw her. Eiko was barely conscious, her hair matted to her face, her body half submerged in muddy rainwater. Her eyes flickered open, then closed again. Her lips were cracked. Her hands clutched her stomach with desperate instinct. Time collapsed in that moment. Protocol didn't matter. Orders didn't matter. There was only one fact. A woman was giving birth, and she was going to die without help. Murray dropped to his knees at the crater's edge. Banks opened the medical kit. Hana slid down into the water without hesitation. The air trembled with distant explosions. But they didn't move. They stayed. Murray reached Eiko first, sliding down the crater wall with his boots slipping in the wet earth. The water in the depression was murky and cold, tinged red near her thighs. She was shivering, her breaths shallow and rapid. Her abdomen was tense and distended. He pressed his fingers gently against her belly and could feel the baby's position. Wrong, too high. This wasn't a delivery that could wait or fix itself with time. It was a crisis unfolding in seconds. Hana moved to Eiko's side, kneeling in the water without hesitation. She tried to speak to the woman, murmuring in Japanese, but Eiko's eyes only rolled back in her head. Her body convulsed with another contraction. She was fading. Corporal Banks opened the field pack and began pulling out supplies, setting them down on a rain poncho spread over the mud. Everything was wet. Everything was filthy, but it was all they had. The baby was in breach. Worse still, the umbilical cord had slipped into the birth canal, prolapsed and dangerous. It would strangle the infant before it ever drew breath. Murray knew it the second he checked. There was no time to prepare a full surgical site, no time to sterilize. The rain was still falling. Artillery rumbled in the distance. He asked Hana to keep Aiko steady and conscious, while Banks handed him the only tools they had, a scalpel, gauze, and a metal clamp. Murray splashed water onto his hands from a canteen and wiped them on a piece of gauze soaked in alcohol. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But he couldn't let her or the baby die without trying. Kneeling between Aiko's legs, he made the incision. The water in the crater rose around him as the rain intensified. There was no light except the gray of the clouds and the dim glint of steel. Aiko did not scream. She was already too far gone. Hana held her shoulders while whispering prayers. The cut was clean, but the muscle gave resistance. Murray's hands worked quickly, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of an old life before the war. He reached into the uterus and found the baby, small, limp, unmoving. The cord was wrapped tightly around its neck twice. He clamped and cut. The baby came out blue. It wasn't breathing. Murray passed it immediately to Banks, who cleared the airways and began compressions. Hana turned Aiko's head, checking for signs of life. Her pulse fluttered, weak but there. Rain beat down on them like war drums. Banks rubbed the baby's back, whispered nonsense in English. The child made no sound. Then a cough. Then another. A thin, hoarse cry rose from the baby's throat, torn, pitiful, alive. Banks let out a shaky breath. Hana gasped, hands trembling. Murray sat back on his heels, soaked to the bone, his gloves stained with blood and soil. The baby was breathing. They had saved him. Against every odd and logic, they had pulled life from mud and rain. No one spoke for a long moment. The war still howled in the hills around them. But in that crater, for a single heartbeat, there was only silence and breath. The newborn's cries grew steadier, rhythmic. Iko's chest lifted slowly. She was alive, but fading. They would have to move her soon. But for now, they just watched the baby breathe, each fragile inhale louder than the bombs. The baby's cries, though faint and shaky, echoed louder in the soldiers' ears than any shell burst. It was a sound none of them expected to hear again in this war, a sound of beginning, not ending. Hana cradled the infant in her arms, rocking gently as the rain drizzled down her back. His skin was cold and slick, his breath shallow but steady. She wrapped him in the only cloth available, a piece of Sergeant Murray's undershirt torn into strips. The child smelled of blood and smoke, but to her, he smelled alive. Sergeant Murray turned his attention back to Aiko. Her eyelids fluttered, and her breathing was labored, but her pulse was holding. He cleaned the wound as best he could with muddy water and alcohol, then stitched it closed with trembling hands. Every second felt like a gamble. His training had never prepared him for surgery in a pool of rainwater, but somehow his hands remembered what duty required when all else failed. The three of them made a silent decision. There would be no evacuation yet. Moving her now would be more dangerous than staying put. They were deep in contested territory, without a clear path back, and the next shell could fall at any moment. So they dug in. Banks began scooping water out of the crater with a canteen cup. Murray fashioned a makeshift platform out of branches and his own jacket to keep Aiko elevated above the rising water. Hana stayed with the baby, whispering soft syllables in Japanese to keep him calm. The hours blurred together. Thunder cracked in the distance, and the occasional artillery blast made the ground shudder beneath them. Yet inside the crater, a strange quiet formed, a protective shell of purpose. They rotated shifts. When one grew cold or exhausted, another took over. Banks shared what little food they had, a piece of dry biscuit, a chocolate square. Most of it went to Hana, who needed the strength to feed the baby drops of water from a cloth to keep him from dehydrating. As dusk approached, the rain returned in heavy sheets. They huddled together, their bodies forming a human barrier against the elements. The waterline crept higher, but they refused to move Eiko until her blood pressure stabilized. Her face had softened slightly, her breathing slowed but not stopped. The baby, exhausted from his ordeal, now slept against Hana's chest, wrapped in a damp poncho and a prayer. At one point, Banks whispered that he couldn't believe any of it was real. Murray didn't respond. He just looked at the boy, then at the mother, then at his own blood-caked hands. In war, everything decayed: flesh, sanity, rules. But this was something untouched, something they had made instead of destroyed. As night fell, a red flare shot up in the distance. Friendly forces were sweeping the area, signaling their presence. Banks climbed out of the crater and waved a flashlight under his coat 3 times, the prearranged signal. Minutes later, voices answered through the fog. Help was on the way. But for the trio in the crater, time had already bent around them. They weren't waiting for rescue. They were holding on to life. 3 fragile hearts still beating against the sound of thunder. The medics arrived under the cover of twilight, moving with urgency but careful precision. They carried stretchers through the mud, guided by the intermittent flashlight signals from Banks. When they reached the crater, they paused in stunned silence. One soldier murmured something under his breath upon seeing the woman and child alive, surrounded by 3 exhausted figures soaked in mud and blood. No one spoke much as they gently lifted Eiko from the rainwater, her body limp but still breathing. The baby, swaddled in the remnants of an army shirt and a poncho, was placed in Hana's arms for the ride back. They were transported in a field ambulance jeep that bounced over every cratered ridge. Tent 7B stood near the rear line, one of the few remaining medical tents that hadn't been relocated due to shelling. It was overcrowded, understaffed, and often without power. But for Eiko and her son, it was a sanctuary. As they were brought in, nurses made space immediately. Word had traveled fast over the radio. A woman had given birth in a bomb crater, and both mother and child had survived. Doctors examined Eiko and the baby under kerosene lamplight. They confirmed internal bleeding had been minimal, and Murray's field stitches had likely saved her life. The baby was small, underweight, but strong. One nurse whispered it was a miracle. Another called it madness. Either way, the tent felt different that night, less like a hospital, more like a chapel. Even patients nearby seemed to breathe easier, as if the cries of the newborn reminded them that something other than death could still enter the world. Outside, the war went on. The horizon flashed with artillery, and planes thundered overhead. But inside Tent 7B, the world contracted to the sound of a child's breathing. Soldiers stopped by one, offering food, clean cloth, anything they had. Someone gave a can of condensed milk. Another left a deck of playing cards beside the baby as a joke. It wasn't much, but it was something. Some proof that even in war, compassion could still take shape in the smallest gestures. Murray returned hours later to check on his patient. Eiko was conscious, her face pale but calm. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then her eyes dropped to the child cradled against Hana's chest. Her lips moved, forming a whisper. "Why did you stay?" Murray didn't answer. He just reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the bloody piece of undershirt that had wrapped the baby, and folded it into her hand. The baby's name came the next day, Kazuhiko. It meant harmonious light. Hana wrote it carefully on a slip of paper and placed it beside his cot. Soldiers passing through the tent began referring to him as the crater baby, half in awe, half in disbelief. Photographers from the division's press unit arrived a few days later and captured the image. Eiko sitting upright, baby in arms, surrounded by 3 mud-streaked medics. It would become one of the most widely circulated photographs of the Pacific War. But none of them sought recognition. When asked for a statement, Murray simply said, "We didn't save anyone. We just refused to let them die." In that quiet, overcrowded tent, far from medals and headlines, a new life had been pulled from the dirt. And in doing so, it had reminded every soldier there what they had forgotten, what it meant to be human. The story of the crater birth spread faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, soldiers across the division were talking about the baby born in mud beneath falling shells. Some treated it as myth, others as fact, but all felt the weight of its meaning. In a war where every day brought more death, the image of life breaking through shook something loose in hardened men. Tent 7B became a quiet pilgrimage site. Soldiers dropped by not out of duty, but out of need, to remind themselves there was still something left to protect. Inside the tent, life moved cautiously forward. Iko regained her strength slowly. Still too weak to sit for long, but now able to hold Kazuhiko in her arms. She fed him with trembling hands and stared at him as if trying to memorize every blink, every breath. Hana helped her write short letters in Japanese, messages that might never reach anyone. She still didn't know if her village had survivors. The war had taken her past. All that remained was the child. Murray refused every offer of commendation. A citation had been drafted, his name marked for the Bronze Star, but he asked it be withdrawn. He didn't believe what they had done was heroism. To him, staying in that crater hadn't been a choice, it had been the only answer. He told the commanding officer, "We didn't rescue anyone, we just stood still when the rest of the world ran." No one argued, but his request was respected. There was no ceremony, no medal, just silence. Banks, on the other hand, found himself changed in ways he hadn't expected. He began keeping a small notebook, documenting not wounds, but moments, smiles, quiet recoveries, the rare sound of laughter in the camp. He wrote about the baby who slept through thunder and the mother who had been too exhausted to cry. These fragments, he hoped, would outlive the war itself. He had stopped believing in glory, but he still believed in memory. Even the higher command noticed a shift in the men. Morale improved, slightly but measurably. Incidents of violence and breakdowns declined around the field hospital. Some said it was coincidence. Others believed it was the boy, that his life reminded everyone theirs hadn't ended yet either. A nurse whispered once, "He sleeps like the war isn't real." And for a few minutes, when people watched him, it wasn't. Hana prepared to return to California. Her tour was ending, but she struggled to let go. On her last day, she handed Aiko a cloth bundle. Inside were scraps of army fabric, bits of paper with English and Japanese phrases, and a single photo of the 3 medics taken behind Tent 7B. "So he knows who was there," she said. Aiko nodded without speaking. Her eyes said enough. That night, the tent fell quiet earlier than usual. Outside, distant flashes lit the hills, but inside was peace. Murray sat near the cot, watching Kazuhiko sleep. He thought of all the lives that hadn't made it out, the faces he'd closed the eyes of. Then he looked at the boy's chest, rising and falling. A rhythm, a future, a small, impossible defiance against everything the war tried to erase. 3 years after the war ended, Sergeant John Murray returned to Okinawa, alone and unannounced. The island had changed. Roads had been cleared, homes rebuilt, the jungle pushed back. But the scarred earth still remembered. He walked slowly across the field where it had happened, now overgrown with grass and scattered with wildflowers. The crater, though softened by time, was still there. Rain had smoothed its edges, but the hollow remained, like a wound that never fully closed. At the edge of the crater stood a small stone marker, simple and weathered, half buried in moss. It bore no military insignia, no national flags, only a short inscription in 2 languages. Here, a child was born during fire, because someone stayed. Murray stood in silence, his cap in his hands. He wasn't sure who had placed the marker. Maybe Iko, maybe someone from the hospital. It didn't matter. It was enough that it existed. Moments later, a woman approached from the nearby path, holding the hand of a young boy. She was older now, but Murray recognized her immediately. Iko nodded once, solemnly. The boy, Kazuhiko, looked up at the man his mother had told him about. He didn't speak, only stepped forward and placed a small flower at the foot of the stone. Then he stepped back and took his mother's hand again. No words were exchanged. They simply stood together at the edge of that crater, one that had held not just mud and rain, but pain, birth, and survival. When it was time to go, Iko bowed slightly, and Murray did the same. It was quiet, reverent, and final. That place, once filled with the chaos of war, had become something else entirely, a memory rooted in earth. Over the years, others came. Soldiers who had served in Okinawa brought their families. Some remembered the story. Others simply felt drawn to the stillness. Locals began referring to it not by coordinates or battle maps, but as the place where the baby was born. Children whispered about it during festivals. Teachers used it to speak about mercy, about war, about what it means to save. The photograph taken behind Tent 7B eventually made its way into a museum. No names, just a caption. Birth in a Bomb Crater, Okinawa, 1945. Visitors paused longer at that frame than any other. Veterans stared at it for minutes, sometimes with tears in their eyes. It had become a relic of something war rarely left behind, hope without condition. Murray never returned again. He lived quietly, never giving interviews, never accepting awards. But he kept one thing on his mantle until the day he died: a faded strip of cloth from the undershirt used to swaddle Kazuhiko, folded and tucked into a box. On the inside of the lid, in his own handwriting, he had written 7 words. Sometimes staying is the only kind of winning. And the crater remained. It did not grow over. It did not disappear. It stayed, just as they had, holding the memory of a war, a birth, and 3 people who refused to walk away.